Muy buenas noches a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la Conferencia Magistral Cuando el Estado quiere silenciar a la prensa, organizada por el Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. Mi nombre es Carla Minet, soy la directora ejecutiva del centro y les agradecemos el continuo apoyo que se manifiesta hoy aquí ah, en esta actividad. Gracias también a nuestra junta de directores, muchos de ellos aquí, ellos y ellas. Gracias por liderar la Junta del Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. En especial también quiero reconocer el esfuerzo de nuestro equipo de trabajo, nuestro equipo de desarrollo, Anet Ramírez, Sharon Tosas, a nuestro equipo técnico y de redes sociales que también está aquí, al programa de transparencia, Carlos Francisco Ramos, a la gran Gabriela Dávila y pues, especialmente a ellos por la iniciativa de organizar este evento, a Carlos Francisco en particular, y también a nuestros periodistas, que están muchos de ellos aquí hoy, nuestra chequeadora de datos, nuestras editoras. Muchas gracias por el trabajo que hacen todos los días para sostener al Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. Esta actividad de hoy abre lo que en Estados Unidos se conoce como el Sunshine Week. Aquí también le llamamos la Semana de la Transparencia. I'm going to switch to English so our guests can follow. In addition to doing investigations, training journalists, and educating the public about independent investigative journalism, for the past 18 years, the CPI has remained committed to access to public information in Puerto Rico. Over the past year, in defense of our work, our profession, and the public we serve, the CPI was compelled to speak out about the dangers of Senate Bill 63, which amended the transparency law of Puerto Rico. That ill-conceived measure was ultimately approved after barely half a day of public hearings and without addressing a single objection or recommendation raised by civic groups, more than 20 organizations that oppose the bill. It is now in effect and has already made our work much harder. We were also forced recently to go to court to defend something we never imagined would require defending, our right to enter La Fortaleza and to ask the governor questions. So far, we've won that battle. I mention this just to give two examples of how, especially today, the work done by the CPI is urgent in the current context in Puerto Rico and the United States, where the state has normalized attacks against the press and consistently and deliberately hides what happens behind closed doors. Our guest today, David McCraw, knows a great deal about that. From his work at the New York Times, David witnessed some of the most consequential legal controversies involving the press in the United States, including situations in which journalists have been kidnapped, are in conflict zones, are threatened, or are denied entry to government facilities. That is why it is so valuable today to hear his perspective, but I will let his student, Carlos Francisco Ramos Hernandez, our in-house lawyer at CPI, to properly introduce him in a moment. This week, we are joining media outlets in Puerto Rico and the US, civic organizations, and citizens to promote access to information as a requirement for a true democracy. In addition to today's keynote lecture, tomorrow we will host a breakfast with our guest, David McCraw. And on Friday, we will have a free webinar on how to make public records requests in light of the recent amendments to the transparency law. Before we begin with our guest, I must mention the allies who make this series of events possible, because it is important to acknowledge them. The law firm Goldman Antonetti Cordova, GFR Media, Hotel Don Rafa, and of course, the Interamerican University, the Law School of the Interamerican University, which beyond this series of activities has been a strategic ally to CPI since its earliest days. That is why I would like to ask the school dean, Julio Fontanet, to offer a welcoming remark.
Buenas tardes todos, todas y todes. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. A special welcome to Mr. David McCraw. Welcome to Inter Derecho. Welcome to Puerto Rico. We are very honored to have you here. Yo creo que es evidente que mientras más autoritario es un Estado, es un presidente, es un gobernador, más se refleja en su ataque constante a la libertad de expresión. Y de eso hemos tenido mucho en Puerto Rico. Hemos visto legislación para limitar el acceso a información. Hemos visto también gobernadora de turno que plantea que no quiere a determinado periodista cubriendo noticias que se realizan en Fortaleza. Hemos visto en Estados Unidos las cosas que están pasando. Hace pocos o unos días vimos al secretario de Guerra o de Defensa decir, cuestionando a los medios, por querer reseñar la identidad de aquellos militares que han fallecido en el conflicto entre Estados Unidos, Israel e Irán, cuestionando el por qué quieren realzar unas noticias muy particulares de un conflicto bélico, cuando evidentemente mientras más guerras hay, más acceso a información debe existir. Conversaba cuando entrabas para acá con Carlos Ramos sobre estos temas y nos planteábamos lo siguiente, sobre todo la importancia de David McCraw y del New York Times. En estos momentos de tanta persecución, particularmente por el gobierno de Trump, hemos visto dos reacciones. La reacción de los que claudican, de los que negocian, porque le han tenido miedo a la persecución fiscal, le han tenido miedo inclusive cuestionando a los abogados de esas entidades. Y hemos visto, ha sido una reacción de entrega, de negociar. Si algo que tenemos que admirar del New York Times es que no ha dado un paso atrás, se ha enfrentado a ese proceso, no está negociando, y por eso la presencia de David McCraw es bien importante esta noche en Puerto Rico para escuchar cuál es la estrategia, cuál es el modelo que debemos seguir, porque evidentemente el modelo de claudicar, de no defender la libertad de expresión, no es una opción para nosotros. Así es que espero que la actividad sea de provecho y de entrenamiento para todos nosotros, pero sobre todo felicito al Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, esa institución tan cercana de nosotros por la iniciativa de esta actividad y por ser estandarte de la defensa del derecho a libertad de expresión en Puerto Rico. Buenas noches nuevamente.
Gracias, decano, por el apoyo tan consecuente al Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. Muy buenas noches, bienvenidos y gracias por estar aquí. I'm going to switch to English also to introduce tonight's guest speaker, David McCraw. But before I do, I want to tell you more about, before I tell you more about his career, I want to begin with a short story about how this conference came about. Almost 5 years ago, I began working at Centro de Periodismo Investigativo as an Equal Justice Works Fellow, which allowed me to carry out public interest legal work focused on access to information and transparency rights. A few months into my fellowship, I traveled with the CPI team to the Investigative Reporters and Editors IRE annual conference, where I met journalists from across the United States and around the world and learned about their investigations, the best way to uncover public records, and participated in a few legal workshops on press freedoms issues. What a fascinating first work trip. But I distinctively remember sitting at the dinner on the last night of that conference with Carla Minet and Omaya Sosa Pascual and saying, I think I want to be a full-time media lawyer. I realized there were so many more interesting aspects of the law on top of access to information. When I came back from that trip, I shared the same aspiration with my supervisor and mentor, Oscar Serrano. A few weeks later, he came back to my office holding a book and said, if you really want to understand what media lawyers do, You should read this. The book was A Truth in Our Time by David McCraw. Needless to say, I devoured it over that weekend and learned about the legal battles behind some of the most consequential journalism of our time. From defending the reporting during Trump's first term to supporting investigative journalism connected to the Me Too movement and the fall of Harvey Weinstein, to freedom of information battles regarding US national security reporting and navigating the complex worldwide legal issues surrounding WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. I learned a lot and confirmed my aspirations. After reading it, I became more curious about the person behind those stories. I want to understand how someone ends up doing this kind of work, so I started researching on his background. I learned that David did not begin his career as a lawyer. He first studied journalism at the University of Illinois and worked as a journalist himself. He later pursued graduate studies in communication at Cornell University and spent several years teaching journalism and directing the journalism program at Marist College. Only after that did he decide to go to law school, earning his JD from Albany Law School, where he graduated first in his class. And after clerking at the New York Court of Appeals and working a few years at a private law firm, he moved fully into media law and eventually became deputy general counsel at the New York Daily News, a faster paced, more tabloid-oriented newsroom. From there, he joined the New York Times, where he now has spent more than 2 decades helping to guide the legal strategy of one of the world's most influential news organizations. Today, he serves as the Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, leading the newsroom, legal team, and advising journalists on issues such as defamation, libel, subpoenas and leaks, freedom of information, and all things First Amendment related, as well as other corporate matters. And then he's also a law professor. And here's where my story circles back. Last year, I had the incredible opportunity to be accepted into the LM program at Harvard Law School. And one of the things that made that opportunity even more exciting was taking David's mass media law course. In fact, enrolling in his course was one of the main reasons why I ultimately decided to go to Harvard. In class, I probably participated and asked too many questions, but David was always generous with his time, whether during class discussions, during office hours, or over lunch, where I kept asking even more questions. On the last day we met of his office hours in Cambridge, I told him, one day I want to bring you to Puerto Rico. I felt that conversation we were having about press freedoms and government transparencies and the legal battles surrounding journalism were deeply connected to the work that we're doing at CPI. What I didn't imagine was that an opportunity for the visit would come so fast at a moment where the New York Times itself is engaged in more legal battles over Trump's constant attacks on the press and the new directive to enter the Pentagon, which would resonate too strongly with the work we're doing at Centro de Periodismo Investigativo covering the Jennifer González Colón administration. So for me, this moment feels a bit surreal. From reading his book and thinking, I want to be a media lawyer, to starting to become a media lawyer, to having him as a professor, and now having the privilege of introducing him here in Puerto Rico. Así que les pido un fuerte aplauso para nuestro conferenciante magistral, David McCraw.
Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for tolerating my Middle American English. I will try to make sense. I would not make sense in Spanish. It was a great pleasure to have Carlos in class. He, of course, paid back the debt by introducing me to Mofongo today over lunch. We're now even. I want to thank CPI and for their good work and for making this possible. I've been a lawyer at the New York Times for 24 years, and so nothing I say today will surprise you. You know my opinion. But many people assume, wrongly, that my ideas about press freedom, my ideas about journalism were formed on the island of Manhattan, that other island, not as pretty as this one. But that's not so. I grew up in a tiny farm town in Illinois. Both my father and my mother were World War II veterans. It was a deeply conservative place. And if you were a child growing up in Illinois in the 1960s and 1970s, there was one political truth that you knew from a young age: the governor goes to jail. That was how it worked in Illinois. Otto Kerner, Dan Walker, Bill Stratton, all governors, all ended up in jail. Well, in fairness, Stratton was only indicted, but when Paul Powell, who was the Secretary of State of Illinois when I was a kid, died, they found $800,000 in cash in shoeboxes in the hotel room where he was living. My parents and their conservative friends and neighbors believed in a free press. They held out the hope that if we at least had journalists who were allowed to do what journalists do, maybe they could stop these people from stealing from them. For those of us growing up then, faith in a free press was not a liberal value or a conservative value, it was an American value. And I'm not talking about ancient history. 15 years ago, Congress passed the most significant libel law in its history, the U.S. Speech Act. It protects American publishers from foreign libel judgments won in countries that don't believe in press freedom the way we do. The vote in the House was unanimous. The vote in the Senate was unanimous. Every Republican, every Democrat, whatever we thought about each other's politics, there was an American consensus that our press needed to be safeguarded to do its job. And that was only 15 years ago. We are in a different place today. We live in a country now where those in government routinely declare that the independent press is fake news, the enemy of the people, a threat to national security. It is an effort to marginalize and devalue the press in the eyes of the public. Press freedom was never meant to be an end in itself. It is not in the Constitution to serve the press. It's great that it creates jobs for journalists at the New York Times and the CPI, but that was not the end goal. It is in the Constitution to serve the public. The idea is simple, and to use President Trump's favorite adjective, kind of beautiful. If you have a free press, it can be a check on power, and it can give people the information they need to exercise their own power, to cast intelligent votes, to demand changes, to encourage elected officials to do better and to do more. It was not that the authors of the First Amendment thought bad people would end up in public office. It was they knew that the combination of human nature and the possession of power could cause leaders to act in a way that needed to be checked by a free and vigilant press working in the public's best interest. There are great civil servants, but there are too many people in power, people in elected office, people wearing badges, who don't want the kind of scrutiny that an independent press brings. Why would they? It is so much easier for them to do their jobs when no one is looking, when the truth is locked away and buried. Too many people in government want what I call a democracy of sleep, where citizens are never awakened to the unpleasant and inconvenient truths about the things that are being done in their name. So when you hear the president denounce the press as the enemy of the people, and then you see FBI agents raiding the home of a Washington Post reporter, understand this: those two things are related. They are just different pages in the same playbook. Convince the public the press doesn't matter and shouldn't be listened to, and at the same time use the power of government to undermine the work of journalists. If you can succeed at the former, you can get away with the latter. In other words, the current fight over press freedom is both a fight for the hearts and minds of the public and an attack on the right of the press to cover the news independently. In some ways, it reminds me of where I found myself 10 years ago. If you happen to know anything about me before tonight, you probably know this. In October of 2016, I wrote a letter to candidate Donald Trump's lawyers defending a story that the Times had just run. It was a story that focused on two women who said they had been groped by Mr. Trump years earlier. Mr. Trump's lawyers were not happy. They wrote a letter threatening to sue the New York Times. It was my job to respond. I thought it was a fair story. I thought it was an important story, and it provided information I thought voters should have. I didn't think presidential candidates should be running around threatening lawsuits, trying to silence the truth. I think it's fair to say my letter was a little direct, a little pointed. I suggested that Donald Trump didn't have a reputation to defend when it came to how he treated women. My boss had wished I left that paragraph out, but it ended up with a full-throated defense of press freedom. In fact, it ended up with an invitation that if Donald Trump was unhappy, he should sue us. This is how I ended it. We did what the law allows. We published important information about a subject of deep public concern. If Mr. Trump disagrees, if he believes that American citizens had no right to hear what these women had to say, and that the law of this country forces us and those who would dare to criticize him to stand silent or be punished, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight. People asked me afterwards whether I got the approval of management to include that paragraph. I mean, to invite Donald Trump to sue us, that's usually not really the heads-up baseball move. And the truth was, I had talked it over with colleagues and sent it out. And it was immediately on the internet and around a lot, which I'll talk about in a second. But in those days, I had a glass office. And one of the really bad things about having a glass office is that you can see when your CEO is coming at you with your letter in his hand and you haven't cleared it with him. My professional future passed in front of my eyes as he approached my office. He came in, he's an Englishman, Mark Thompson, now the head of CNN. And he held up the letter and he said, "Bloody brilliant. But I'll never understand why you Americans capitalize after a colon." That could have gone much worse. Okay. But because their letter had been posted online, I knew our company's communication staff would post mine too. No big deal, just lawyers quibbling, which shows you how little I knew about the internet. I think of myself mainly as a transparency lawyer. I help reporters get documents. I fight for openness. I believe in openness. But let me tell you, you don't know anything about transparency and openness until your employer posts your phone number and email address on the internet. Yes, there it was on my letter that they put up on the internet. Suddenly, hundreds of emails began pouring in. They came from all over the world. Most of the emails were from strangers. Many were from lawyers, but there was also a nurse and a doctor, retired people, the founder of a nonprofit, law school students, parents whose kids had seen the letter online at college, journalists from other news organizations. I heard from students I had taught 30 years ago, former colleagues, law school classmates I hadn't seen in 2 decades, my brother's high school girlfriend, a person who said we met at a wedding 10 years ago, my ex-wife, too. By the next night, more than 1 million people would come to the New York Times to read the letter. I bring all this up not to relive my 15 minutes of internet fame. As any of you who have had 15 minutes of internet fame know, that's 14 minutes and 30 seconds too long. I bring it up because there seemed to be such an embrace of press freedom by regular people who, unlike me, did not make their living thinking about it and protecting it. Fast forward to today, we're in a different place. The need to find and resurrect public support for press freedom is more critical than ever because the attacks on press freedom are so much more direct and frequent. Think about all you've seen in the past 15 months. The Associated Press being barred from the White House press pool because it would not use the term Gulf of America rather than Gulf of Mexico. The head of the Federal Communications Commission just this weekend threatening to revoke station's broadcast license because he didn't like the media's coverage of the war with Iran. Earlier this year, federal agents raided the home of that Washington Post reporter I mentioned and seized her electronic devices in hopes of finding her confidential sources. Journalist Don Lemon was arrested for covering a protest inside a Minneapolis church. And this is not simply a battle between the federal government and big-time media. It is happening in local communities. In Marion County, Kansas, the local police raided the local paper in an investigation of sources. In Greenwood, Mississippi, a judge ordered the local newspaper to take down an editorial criticizing city officials. In Tennessee, earlier this month, ICE arrested and is trying to deport a Spanish language reporter who had been covering the ICE raids. And of course, it wasn't just Don Lemon who got arrested at that church in Minneapolis. A local journalist, Georgia Fort, was also arrested for covering the protest. There is a strategy there, and those of you who are lawyers will recognize this or work in this area of law, that the attacks really focus on areas where the law has been weak in protecting the press. Subpoenas and oppositions to subpoenas to reporters. The right to gather news, which has never been defended in the courts in the same way that the right to publish has been. And we even see cases now being brought to get around all the protections that are in place for in libel suits, where people are bringing suits for consumer fraud, an untested, untried, but potentially very dangerous area where a story that they claim is fake news, a story they claim is false, is seen not as simply a story to be sued over and not about libel, but is seen as being used to encourage advertisers and encourage readers. A strategy that's really designed to get at the weaknesses of the law. I spend my days on the front lines of the effort to push back to make sure that press freedom continues to be a reality. When the government launches an investigation to find who inside government leaked information to the New York Times, I'm involved. But that's not all of it. I'm involved when the cops stop our photographers from taking pictures outside ICE detention facilities, or when the Pentagon tries to keep reporters from asking questions, or when government agencies ignore their obligations under the Freedom of Information Act and refuse to make records public, or when federal prosecutors say documents have to be kept secret in a public court from the public. Here's the common thread that ties all those things together. People in power want their message to get out and the press to get out of the way. They want to be the only ones who get to tell the public what is true and what is not. Let me give you one guarantee tonight. No matter how long you live, or where you live, or whatever your politics are, there will never be a press release from your mayor's office saying, "We just wasted $40 million. No Secretary of Defense will ever hold a press conference to announce our new weapon systems really look great, but they're kind of crappy. Your governor is never going to take to TV to say, "We just hired my super unqualified uncle to build our new office building, and we paid twice as much as we should." That is why reporters need sources. They depend on government employees who will tell them what is really happening behind the scenes. And those reporters, to get information, are sometimes going to have to promise the sources they won't be named. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine seeing a blockbuster story based on anonymous sources. Assume it's about waste in government or public officials that are hiding misconduct or incompetence. Ask yourself the question, how are public officials going to react to that? Now, one thing they could do is fix the problem. They could stop the waste. They could clean up the errors. They could get rid of the incompetent employees. They could say, "We screwed up and we're going to do something about that." But too often that's not the reaction. Too often the reaction is, "Let's find that person who dared to tell the truth about what we were up to." Leak investigations. I know a little bit about leak investigations. let me take you back to Wednesday, March 3rd, 2021. I was sitting at home doing what I, like many of you did during COVID, staring into a laptop, living my life through my email inbox. I am a newspaper lawyer, so as evening turns to night, my inbox is filling, as it does most days, with messages from journalists at the Times about stories that had legal problems or reporting assignments that could benefit from legal advice. But in the midst of the onslaught of incoming emails, there was one I did not recognize. It looked like spam. It came from a bizarre address, uslawenforcement@google.com, and it had 2 attachments. Yeah, I know the first lesson of information security. Do not click on the attachments in a spam email. Do not do that. I couldn't help myself. I clicked. What popped up on my screen was astonishing. There were 2 orders from a federal court in Washington. They ordered Google to turn over to federal prosecutors the email logs of 4 New York Times reporters who had written important stories about the connection between certain members of the 2016 Trump campaign and Russian operatives. The federal prosecutors were trying to find out who inside government had leaked that information to reporters. It was an investigation that had begun in the final months of the first Trump administration. Here's the interesting thing to me. The order permitted Google to tell one person in the world about the secret order. It was otherwise sealed order. That person was me. I felt a little honored. Secret court proceeding, secret order, and I could be a part of that. But the court had agreed with Google that the Google lawyers who were behind U.S. law enforcement at google.com could tell me so that if I wanted to fight the order, I could. And now that you mention it, I did want to fight the order. As a First Amendment lawyer who works for an organization that believes deeply in free speech, I was in an awkward position. By court order, I couldn't tell anyone anything about any of this. Not the 4 reporters, not my boss, not our publisher, not any other lawyer in the world. Thankfully, I was able to convince the secret judge in the secret proceeding who had issued the secret order that I may need to tell my boss. She would wonder what I was doing with my time, which I was being very mysterious about. And I also convinced the judge that I needed to talk to a national security lawyer to help me out on this. And so for the next 3 months, in secret, we fought to get that order withdrawn. The law in this area is weak. The ability to resist a subpoena under federal law, especially in a national security investigation, is weak. But we kept coming back to the prosecutors talking about how unnecessary it was for them to seek this information and how harmful it was to press freedom. And we finally convinced them to stop, to give up the efforts to get our email records. But there was another chapter to that story after that, and it's an important one. Shortly after the prosecutors dropped their attempt to get our records, my publisher and I were called to a meeting with the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland. Garland wanted to tell us personally that the attempt to get our reporters' records had been a mistake. And a short time later, he announced that the Department of Justice would no longer seek records from journalists when prosecutors were pursuing leak investigations. He saw how damaging that practice was to press freedom, and he was convinced that when a leak investigation was required, it could be done without going after confidential records of reporters. He understood that his role was not just to prosecute crimes, but also to honor the norms and values of democracy, including protecting press freedom. It is an example that other public officials should follow. But there was a second question on our mind that day in the Attorney General's office. There is no question that the government has the power to conduct investigations and find leakers. But that doesn't answer the important question: when should they do that? Leak investigations intimidate. They make it less likely that the next government employee who sees wrongdoing will step forward, unless we have prosecutors and officials who are willing to exercise discretion, to exercise restraint, who will not pursue leak investigations for trivial or personal or political reasons. Leak investigations will be used to choke off information the public needs, and we need judges to understand that too. It won't surprise you to learn that the Trump administration has abandoned Merrick Garland's policy. Reporters' notes and records are again fair game for federal leak investigations, and we've seen an administration that is unusually aggressive in pursuing leak investigations. Our message today, as we continue to fight against that practice, is not that different than the message in 2016 when the threat was of a libel suit from Donald Trump. And that is this: democracy is best served when journalists have the freedom to go out, get information, and publish truth that powerful people want to keep hidden. Which brings us to Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, aka Secretary of War. You may have just seen that the other day that he refused to let photographers into his press conference because he thought some of the photos were unflattering. That probably tells you about everything you need to know about his view of a free and independent press. As some of you know, unrelated to those photos, the Times has sued the Pentagon. We are challenging new restrictions that the Pentagon has placed on reporters who had Pentagon press passes. The idea behind a press pass is pretty simple, right? The Department of Defense gives out press passes to journalists who regularly cover the military. The press pass allows the journalists to come into the Pentagon, to attend news conferences, to talk to people in the building, to cover military affairs. That system has been in place for decades, and there are two truths that you should know about it. One is, national security has never been threatened by any reporter with a Pentagon press pass in all of that time. It has never been a threat that the press is going to jeopardize national security. And in fact, in our case, the Department of Defense admits that is so. The second thing is, the Pentagon has never tried to restrict reporting being done by reporters with press passes. They have understood for decades that reporters should be free to report. That has changed with the new administration. As you know, Secretary Hegseth has been was the subject of highly critical coverage of his personal life and his questionable leadership. So the Pentagon issued new rules. If reporters wanted a Pentagon press pass, they had to agree not to ask questions of military employees anywhere in the world who were not authorized to speak for the Department of Defense. Let me slow that down and say it again, because it's kind of incredible that you had to agree that you wouldn't ask questions of anybody but official spokesmen. Let's make this simple. The Pentagon wanted journalists to report only the official statements of top leadership. Forget about asking people inside the military about waste or sexual harassment or mismanagement. Forget about getting the real story that the leadership didn't want the American people to know about. Do that, and you could lose your press pass. We sued. We said those restrictions were unconstitutional. That, in effect, what the rules were trying to do was drive out independent journalists. They did not want people who believed that journalism should be free of government control. And they did so in a way that gave them the right to pull the press pass or not anytime they wanted. Not surprisingly, 300 journalists chose not to agree to those rules and left. And that included Fox News, Newsmax, CNN, AP, New York Times, Washington Post. Everybody in the established press, whether they were perceived as right or left or someplace else, chose not to do them, not to sign for the new rules. We sued. The judge hasn't ruled yet, but I was heartened during the oral argument when he asked the lawyer for the Pentagon why these rules were necessary. Weren't reporters supposed to ask questions? And if a reporter's question sought information that could not be made public, there was a simple solution, the judge said. The employee could say to the reporter, I can't tell you. Wasn't that how it always worked in democratic societies? Shouldn't we be proud to live in a place where reporters didn't have to toe the government line, where journalists could ask hard questions and write probing stories about what the government was really up to? It was like time traveling to be in that courtroom that morning, back to a time when the press was valued and the government was treated with suspicion. Back to the time of my parents, when I was a boy growing up in Illinois, back to a time when there was a greater understanding of the value of a free press and how it should operate with the government. And I'm hoping this time around that as we move that case forward and similar cases forward, that the public understands something essential for democracy happens in this tiny little act when a reporter asks questions, gets answers, and publishes stories that may not please those in power. Let me close on this note, which I brought up in other forums because I think it's important. There is much discussion in my world among editors and lawyers about how to deal with the new wave of government attacks on journalism and press freedom, whether they're happening here in Puerto Rico or in Washington or in state capitals. Should we try to get along better with the government? Should we give a little to maybe take down the tension? Should we ignore some of the minor stuff? Maybe the government will step back a little if we step back a little. The historian Timothy Snyder has written about anticipatory obedience. Anticipatory obedience. It describes what happens when those who fear what a government may do, who anticipate the demands that may be coming, choose to get in line before the government does anything. Think about that. Anticipatory obedience is a term that should prompt all of us to remember that there are things worse than fighting and losing. Whether it's taking a risky position in court, speaking out about the abuse of power, or pursuing stories that will displease those in government. There are always good reasons to stand down. You have to pick your battles. You can't jeopardize your institution or business. You want to be seen as reasonable. But in the end, as Professor Snyder says, history shows that the only thing that anticipatory obedience does is teach those in power what they can get away with. Much has changed since I was a kid in Illinois, watching governors go from the state house to the jailhouse and seeing the Secretary of State rob the public treasury. But one thing hasn't changed. Independent, fact-driven journalism still matters. If you think we're past the days of public officials acting like Paul Powell, stuffing himself to the tune of $800,000 in cash, you are not paying enough attention to the crypto market or how you get a pardon in this country. We may not be able to stop them, but now is not the time to pull back. There's too much work to be done. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You can sit in the middle.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, David, for sharing with us your leadership and how current events are affecting press freedom. Now we'll go to the Q&A with Omaya Sosa Pascual and Oscar Serrano, co-founders of CPI. El público también puede formular preguntas en tarjetas que vamos a estar pasando para tratar de agarrar las más que podamos antes de terminar la actividad. Así es que ya mismo vamos a pasar por los pasillos con las tarjetas. Adelante, Oscar. Omaya tiene los micrófonos ahí.
Buenas noches. Gracias a todos por estar acá. Gracias a todos por el apoyo al Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. Estamos acercándonos al aniversario número 20 de esta institución y del trabajo que hacemos. Y obviamente ha sido solamente posible por el apoyo constante de públicos como ustedes. Hoy también nos están viendo por internet y mañana pues veremos a otras personas en la actividad con David, así que simplemente antes de seguir con la actividad quería volver a decirle gracias a todos ustedes que apoyan el trabajo del Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, y las críticas también son bienvenidas, o sea, no se preocupen que podemos recibir de todo. Vamos a conducir la charla en inglés, igual que la que ocurrió la actividad. David, I was just remarking that we're very close to the 20th anniversary of the Center for Investigative Journalism. I was thanking everyone for their support before having the conversation with you. So I guess I'll go first. How can journalism confront a government when that government dominates directly or indirectly pretty much all three branches of what's supposed to be a system of check and balances, and that uses its power and agencies to intimidate, silence, or even buy media outlets, to eliminate transparency and to restrict access to information? Basically, what do you do when you think the system of check and balances that should be in place is kind of broken?
Is this working?
It should. Try it.
Okay, is that working? Okay, thank you. As I was telling Omaya and Oscar, they could have sent up 2 lawyers to question me, and I would have had an easy time. They spent Puerto Rico's 2 finest journalists, so thank you by starting with such a hard question. There's no single answer to that question. It's being faced by reporters in a lot of places, and I think that you have to think of a variety of strategies. One thing is we need to have allies in law. We need to have courts, and sometimes this is not in our control. We need courts that understand the importance of protecting press freedom. We have had a pretty good run of that, despite changes in the judiciary. We need to do more to rally the public to our side. We need to sell what we do. The New York Times has spent a whole lot of time trying to explain more how journalism gets done. If that includes everything, as you now see at the top of our stories, a little paragraph about how we got the story and who we interviewed and so forth. We do pieces about the development of reporting, things that led to stories that we're proud of. And all those kind of things help. I think we need to be out more talking about it. There's not going to be one solution to this. And there's really been an attack, I think, in the last year on our natural allies. Look at the attack on universities, look at the attacks on law firms. And I think part of that is to avoid having those alliances come together, but we need them. We need universities to help us get the message out. We need law firms to help us get the message out. And at the end of the day, it's going to be frustrating. It's going to take time, and you really just have to persist.
Thank you. Buenas noches a todos y todas. Un cortitito digo que estoy bien emocionada de ver esto tan lleno, así que esto me da mucha esperanza de cómo pueden progresar las cosas en Puerto Rico, ¿verdad? Y en el mundo. Gracias por su presencia. I was just thanking them. I'm really happy to see this so full, so there's a lot of interest. That was a great presentation, David. But going to what you were just talking about right now, my question goes into one of the things you discuss in your book, The Truth in Our Times. You are somewhat critical about the New York Times coverage of President Trump during his first political campaign, making reference to the perceived bias, liberal bias of journalists, and that's a criticism we face here in Puerto Rico frequently too. You also found out early in Trump's first term that we were in a whole new game in terms of freedoms of the press. You just talked a lot about it in your presentation. And that you had the premonition that was so true, that a lot of things would have changed after the book would have been on the streets. So do you still think the same way, or have your thoughts changed on these two issues? We heard some in your presentation, but I'm talking about the journalist coverage of the administration and the administrations dealing with the press, both sides.
Yeah, and let me sort of fill in a little bit about this question of bias, because it comes up a lot. And I think that, as I say in the book, that the bias that people talk about isn't really the bias that's there. There's a sense that the press is naturally liberal. I think what the press is naturally in favor of the little guy. That I went to journalism school. Nobody went to journalism school saying, I want to make the rich richer. I want to make the powerful more powerful. You know, they were looking at, you entered journalism to try to move things. And that means if somebody's getting a raw deal, you want to help by shedding light on that. If government's not acting in accordance with what the public needs, you want to shed light on that. And I think what becomes important, though, because reporters bring their own life experiences with them, is two things. One is that editors need to constantly be vigilant and push back on everything that you get in a story. Are you sure this? Is that the right word? Is this the language? Is there tone that should change? And that having editors, which is a very unpleasant thing for both reporters and lawyers, is a necessary part of the process. The second thing is that you need reporters who do what all good reporters do, and that is they try to prove themselves wrong. It's a little bit like the scientific method, that great reporters will say, this is how it looks to me. Now I'm going to go out and try to find out what the counter narrative is. I'm going to go out and find out what I didn't think was true. And when you do that, and a very good reporter I know talks about running into himself coming around the circle, that you've now looked at it from everybody's point of view and you realize that you have the story. So I think those kind of things help develop trust, which becomes important. They develop trust with your readers. And on the government side, it's very much like I was saying to Oscar, is that you just have to keep pushing these things, and you have to have a certain amount of optimism and faith that the public's going to get what you're doing, the judges are going to understand, and the judges are going to be fair about it. It's not going to happen every time, but you have to just keep doing that.
Because of what you just mentioned, that reporters become reporters because they think they can defend the little guy and speak what others cannot speak. I wanted to question you about this idea that, or maybe more like a general practice, the media and reporters tend to be very much focused on covering the public sector, what the government is doing, legislature, courts, etc. And it's a simple question probably for you, but probably for the public it's a very important one. Do the liberties of the press and speech cover in the same way when you're writing about the government or when you're writing about a private corporation? And how important it is for media and reporters actually to remember that the private sector exists and is doing some things that are worth covering?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if those of you who have followed press law will remember that in 1964, the Supreme Court handed down Times versus Sullivan, which set a very high standard for public officials to sue for libel. It was designed to stop public officials from using libel as a weapon, using libel suit as a weapon. 3 years later, the Supreme Court came back to the topic and said that standard should also apply to public figures, not just to public officials, a recognition that people in the private sector have great impact on society, and the press should be empowered to cover them aggressively and carefully and as well. Now, obviously, it's a much tougher thing to cover private companies. There's no Freedom of Information Act. There's no Public Records Act that they don't have to be as forthcoming, and they usually aren't. But it's really incredible to do that. And the thing that, and just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. In fact, it's the reason you should do it. Having the companies have enormous influence. I think back to some of the great moments in journalism were about coverage of private companies. The end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, coverage of Standard Oil and the monopolization of the oil companies of our economy done by investigative reporters, investigation of the meat industry and the unsanitary conditions done by reporters revolutionized the way food was handled in the United States, and the same with the oil companies, and led to the breakup of the move to stop the monopolies. I think of the same thing when people at the Times and other news organizations are covering Google and Apple and Meta. They are the Standard Oil of our times. They are the meat industry of our times. We need to be able to go out and cover them and explain what they're doing. Everything from your privacy to your children's social media habits to their enormous wealth and how they're using it to influence world politics.
To me, you talked about a lot of the cases that the New York Times and other media outlets are fighting in the States. And to me, I was actually going to ask the status of the Department of Defense and Pete Hegseth's case, and you already talked about it. And I'm really glad you have hope. I heard hope in your voice with that case. But it's very telling that we have in Puerto Rico similar cases with our governor, which is she's a part of the Republican Party, and also likes to mimic a lot what President Trump does. In one case that we talked beforehand about, it's a little similar to the Washington Post case. In Puerto Rico, we covered CPI, the general election, and we received a leak of a lot of electoral registries. And the government decided to investigate CPI to try and find out about our source. We still do not know anything about it. It's still an open investigation, and it's kind of scary. So my question is, what do you expect these things to keep up, ramping up? And what can we expect as journalists for our future, for our present?
Yeah, and I've read the papers from that investigation, and I find it distressing. It goes to what I was saying in my speech today, which is that they should focus on the problem, not who called attention to the problem, right? You know, that they shouldn't, rather than looking for who made this known, they should look at what the underlying problem that was made known. But there's two aspects to it. And I touched on this a little bit. One is, do they come after you, after CPI, to get your records? Which I think is incredibly corrosive to press freedom and something that we should resist and push back on. I mean, as I said, Merrick Garland, as Attorney General, issued rules that said when we do leak investigations, we will not try to get journalists information to do that. And in the last week he was in office, I went to another meeting with the Attorney General, and somebody at the meeting said, "Did it hurt you? Did it cause you not to be able to investigate?" He said, "No, it didn't cause us any problems." So they don't need to come to us to do that, and it is damaging. The second part is the question of, well, should they? And I won't sit here and say that no leak should ever be investigated, but it really requires discretion. It really requires a close look at by the government at what it's really up to. Why are we doing this? Are we doing this because we were embarrassed? Are we doing this for political reasons? or is there really some grave danger that was done and that we need to remedy? That question a lot of time doesn't get asked, and it really needs to be answered. With Oscar's last question, I just should say that the other thing, of course, with the that makes it so fraught to cover private industry is they will threaten you with lawsuits in ways that the government does.
Yeah, that's actually my next question.
Yeah, right, okay. Well, yeah.
It is. I mean, no disrespect, but the New York Times is a giant in journalism. So if you're a New York Times reporter, you might feel some comfort that you're going to be protected legally when those threats of libel and slander lawsuits come. So I guess the question I want to ask you is, I want to ask you to maybe step down a little bit from the position of the New York Times and provide your tips and maybe words of encouragement for independent journalists and smaller media outlets that might be threatened by plaintiffs who use defamation suits just as a weapon of intimidation. I mean, there's some people just submit lawsuits that have no merit, but they know that as long as the lawsuit is pending, that journalist or that media outlet is gonna be scared, it's gonna be shielded, it's gonna feel threatened. So any tips for those?
Yeah, and again, there's no one solution here, but obviously the first thing is that you really have to get the story right, that you just have to really double down and make sure that at the end of the day what you have is right, and that it would, in any fair court, you would win. That's not all that comforting if you don't have publishers and editors who are going to stand with you. And that's the second thing is, this is not in our control, but we really need to have those kind of publishers who will stand up for journalism. I happen to work for A.G. Sulzberger. His family has controlled the New York Times since 1896. And he takes it very personally. And one of the things he takes personally is that we will not be intimidated by lawsuits. That's increasingly rare, but it's so important that you have people at the top who are willing to do that. Third thing is you need access to legal services. We were talking earlier out in the hall. I've been involved with a group in New York called Lawyers for Reporters, which provides free legal services to nonprofit journalism entities all over the country. And that is a huge relief for news organizations to know that they can get help, that lawyers can be involved both in reviewing stories and also in dealing with threats afterwards. Another thing, a lot of states have now passed anti-SLAPP laws, which if somebody brings a lawsuit that's aimed at silencing the press can make a motion to have the case dismissed. And in most states with anti-SLAPP laws, the person bringing the suit has to prove that it has merit from the very beginning. It has to show that this has merit. And if that person can't do that, then the person bringing the suit has to pay the legal fees of the publication. That too helps. It helps cut down on the number of cases that they get brought. The other thing, and this is kind of from my own personal experience with this, is that engage with whomever you're taking on. You can't have drive-by journalism on these stories. Tell them what you're going to say. Tell them what you're going to report. Do not let them go into any court and say, this took me by surprise. And then we have to listen to them. We won a Pulitzer Prize several years ago now for coverage of the meat industry. And the meat industry hired very high-powered lawyers who wrote very, very long letters. And I have to say, I sat down with the reporters and we went through the letters. Those letters made the story better. We took seriously what they were saying. Do we have this right? We do. Do we have this right? Not quite. Should we include this fact? Yeah, let's do that. That story got better. ABC did the same story, got sued, and paid millions and millions of dollars in damages in a settlement.
Wow. I want to circle back to the topic of retaining and regaining the trust of the public
Yeah.
and the audience, which is so critical in these times for everybody. And I want to then center it in some strong criticism that the New York Times has received in terms of some coverage recently in topics like the war in Gaza or the arrest of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. I would like to know if the newspaper has editorial standards for the coverage and opinion pieces for these kind of polarizing subjects. If so, do you think they work? Or has the New York Times considered revising them?
The thing I always say in regards to any of these really hard stories, Gaza and Israel is one of those. Trans right is another one. That journalism is an art, not a science. Some days you're not going to make the right decision. There's not any formula that you can do, and I'm sure that sometimes we get it wrong. But one of the things that and Gaza and Israel is particularly hard. There are nights when I'm walking back into the Times building where I have to cut through pro-Palestinian demonstrators to go to my office and respond to criticism that we are too much in favor of Gaza. In fact, we were sued by somebody who said that our coverage was so anti-Israel, and we're dealing with that suit in New Jersey right now. So sometimes we have to kind of check our own when we're criticizing something. Is it our own bias that's driving the criticism? It's not always the case, but always worth thinking about. And the thing I would say is there's sort of an ongoing discussion among editors and standard editors. It doesn't really involve lawyers. I'm thankful I don't have to make these decisions. But, taking a really hard look at the language we use and facts we choose to report, and, for any evidence that we haven't quite got it right. And again, I think one of the things that works as a filter here is we're fortunate enough to be a huge news organization, and I understand that is a position of privilege. But one of the things that comes out of that privilege is we have a lot of people looking at every story. We have an entire standards department looking at stories, and over time, sometimes things shift. The way we covered it may in fact be covered differently the next time. But I think the public feedback is so important. To me, I always want to hear from people who disapprove of our coverage, whichever side they're on any particular issue, and it's enlightening, and it helps us see more clearly if we need to make an adjustment.
Actually, while we read the questions from the public, a quick question, follow-up. Do you feel this time around the coverage of the second Trump administration has changed in light of the lessons learned in the first round?
It has changed, but I think it's more a result of the differences in the administration. This administration is unified. There are not people who, like John Kelly, Jim Mattis, other people who were willing to stand up and say, I disagree with the president, or call attention to it, and people working under them. We're talking to reporters. Now it's very hard to get that. I think that we have really tried, despite Donald Trump having sued us for libel in Florida a few months ago, to try to be as straightforward in our coverage as we can be. There's a lot of stuff going on, and we want to be believed, and we hurt ourselves when we are not playing it straight.
We have questions from the public, and we are very fortunate with the public that we have. They are very intelligent questions. If I had them before, I wouldn't have made my questions, but I got them now. So I will be heartbroken to have to cut any of this. So I think we're gonna do like a quick round.
Okay, I'll be
And
quick.
maybe get your thoughts as fast as you can give them out.
Okay.
Some of these questions are a bit long. They've got a couple of factors. Let's give it a try. Here is a question about your comments on the effect of consolidation of media ownership, the role of oligarchs, billionaires in media ownership right now. Do you see any way to return to an age of local ownership of media?
No.
That's a quick answer.
Right. I think this is one of the huge problems, and I think the hope comes from nonprofits and philanthropy.
Yeah.
To create diverse voices. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try the quick thing too. It's a long question, but I think you can do it quickly. Yeah, a quick answer. What legal institutional obstacles have you encountered when attempting to obtain or report on information related to the Epstein files, particularly in cases where powerful figures, especially political, including former or current presidents, may be implicated?
I need to be a little longer here just to make
Okay,
one. No.
go ahead,
I'm just
go
going to make
ahead.
one thing is that because people want to go home and do this, go to the Epstein files and put my name in. I'm there. Now, fortunately, it's all these briefs I wrote
You don't have
trying
ask
to
me
get
more questions.
right. So all of them are my briefs that I've written because we sued the the Bureau of Prisons to try to get Jeffrey's prison records. We actually succeeded, and so you'll see that. But there is one that when I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, brief, court transcript, that's good. Okay, and then there's this one email. An email. The marketing department, the New York Times, had me write a mass email to subscribers to renew their subscriptions. And apparently I wrote to Jeffrey. Now, I don't know whether he renewed or not.
Was he?
But I do fear that our competitors will have that headline, New York Times reporter, found in Epstein files. A New York Times lawyer found in Epstein files. So the answer is, we've had all of the problems that people had prior to Congress getting in the act. We were constantly filing motions in the Virgin Islands to get records from his estate. We filed in courts in New York to get records from court cases involving him. We were somewhat successful in New York. We had zero success in the Virgin Islands. Now, and I think this is what really people are getting at, we're kind of at the end of the line and what are our options? And we've had a lot of discussions about this. Like, if you really believe that things have not been turned over or things are being withheld improperly, the only real avenue we see is to file Freedom of Information Acts and start that whole Freedom of Information lawsuits and start that whole process over. And there's a lot of interest in doing that.
Great.
What is the most significant legal threat to press freedom you've encountered in your career, and how do you navigate it?
Well, I think that the number one problem currently in the law is the failure of the law to protect sources and to protect people. That in New York State, for instance, in California, New Jersey, elsewhere, if you have a confidential source and there is a state investigation, you have an absolute right not to name your source. Absolute right in state court. In federal court, that is not true. And in federal court is where we're finding a lot of the worst, the most serious attempts to get at sources in national security cases and other cases. So that, to me, is the number one legal threat, is our inability to protect sources to the degree we should. I think that again, focusing on journalists and not the industry and oligarchs and all that sort of thing, the abuse that journalists have to face online and in person is really, really a unfortunate factor harming what the public gets to know. When you see the president trolling reporters and seeing other people doing that, it's really quite disturbing. Nobody went into journalism to have that kind of abuse heaped on them. It's one thing to disagree with a story, disagree with a coverage decision. It's another thing to have the kind of attacks we're seeing. We have, and let's be honest about this, these attacks disproportionately are at women reporters. And when you see reporters get social media posts, anonymous emails, whatever it might be, saying where their children go to school, you know what that's about, right? And that kind of intimidation, which is done with impunity, is really, really something that's very detrimental to all of us in the end, because it interferes with the way reporting gets done.
Well, I was just thinking about the question I asked you before, and what I didn't get to ask you again was after that, a follow-up, was that we were actually, it had a very strong chilling effect on it was two female reporters, our editorial director, who should be around here, Wilma Maldonado, and me, and we just, we couldn't go on reporting, and we were scared that they would go into our homes to get our stuff, and they don't say anything about it, so we still every now and then think about this, so anyway, just thinking about
No,
that.
and it's let's face it, most of the online threats will never, ever end up in physical violence, but they don't tell you that. They don't say, oh, take me seriously, right? I'm really that person. What they're doing, I mean, look, I have seen a lot of these where it is the person who's on his sixth beer and his third hour of Fox News, and he's decided to, start emailing the New York Times, right? He's going to sober up. It's going to be okay. I had one where this guy wrote a threatening letter to a reporter. I looked at him up. This was the level we're dealing with. He forgot to take off his block signature. So I found out where he worked, and I wrote him at his work email saying I really needed to talk to him very, very immediately about the email he'd sent. He writes back, I will never come to New York again. I will never walk by your building. So, well, that's kind of a funny story, but again, you don't know that about them. You have to take each one of these seriously. We have a big security team. We have to take each one of them seriously, and because we don't want people to get hurt.
And meanwhile, journalists are thinking about this while trying to do their jobs.
That's right.
So here, another question dealing with the how do you retain the trust of the public? But I like it because it's a different angle. How do you keep or generate trust in traditional journalism when we live in a media swamp with misinformation 24/7? We didn't talk about that too much.
Yeah, really big topic is that that when you look at what's going on with deep fakes, false information, disinformation, the war in Iran, you realize we're in a new world. There are many of the things we have done in the past about our information intake. It's going to have to change. So, but I mean, I was in Mexico when the cartel violence broke out a few weeks ago, and they were showing planes at the airports being set on fire. The people in the tourists and passengers who were stranded in the terminal didn't see that, but they trusted what they were seeing online, that somehow they hadn't seen it. I mean, when you start to just think about that the reality in front of your eyes, you can no longer trust. You're in a really very different place than you've been before. So I think to answer your question, rather than just harp on the problem, there's two aspects to this. One is I think that we need to do everything possible to establish the trust of your organization, other mainstream organizations, that people need to know they need to come to the front door of CPI. They need to come to the front door of the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, whatever it is. They need to say, stop trusting what you're seeing on social media and figure out the source and go to trusted sources for that. I mean, if you think about it, traditional media, when it had much higher trust ratings, 70% 40 years ago, now 29%. But back in the day, you did not really know what had happened in the Vietnam War. You didn't really have access to what was going on in Europe, but you knew that you could trust the source that you were getting it from. You could trust them, that what they're saying they saw. We need to get back to that you'll never be able to fact check every story that you see, but you can fact check the source of the stories. And much of the media trust work that's being done in schools and elsewhere is being focused on how to learn what sources to trust, not what stories to believe, because that's going to be a fool's errand to try to dig down and find out what really happened in Ukraine.
That takes care of a question I had here. And we are in a law school, so I am contractually obligated to, ask this next question. Any advice for law students, recent graduates interested in becoming First Amendment lawyers? And how was your clerkship at the New York Court of Appeals formative to your work, for your work as a media lawyer?
I rarely mention at the New York Times that I was a journalist because, as I like to say, nobody cried the day I left journalism. I said that I'm a much better lawyer than I was a journalist. It's different skills that I couldn't master. But working at a court, for those of you who are law students, is really important because it gives you a window into how lawyering is done. You see lawyering done well, you see lawyering not done well, and you understand kind of what causes that. I was talking to Carla earlier that about learning to be calm. I was very fortunate to work for a very good judge, and that becomes kind of the test case here is who you work for. I worked for a judge who was a man who was very calm, very deliberate, wanted to do the right thing, and he just had such a sense of wanting to do the right thing. And he made you want to do the right thing. But he also believed that very few problems, very few mistakes couldn't be fixed. And it was this kind of eye-opening thing for me that do the best I could. If I got it wrong, we'll fix it tomorrow. It really brings a certain peace to you to look at life like that.
So they tell me we have one last question,
Okay.
and it's an interesting one. Let's see if what you can say about it. We in Puerto Rico, especially, we have a situation where there's media outlets who have strong interests or are very cozy with the government. I know you have it too, but here there's an very strong economic factor with the government being a very important income source for some of the media outlets. How can journalists keep on looking for public information without the support of a media outlet? If you have any kind of recommendation to negotiate with your media outlet or for going by yourself?
So the question is, like, how do you get information?
How does a journalist that work for these media outlets that are just bought out by the government keep on doing his job or her job?
Who are the ones who are the nodders? Says yes, yeah. And again, it's I hate to keep saying it. It requires a certain amount of persistence that that keeping at it, doing the things that you're doing, hoping that your lawyers and your courts and your readers will stand with you. It's always going to be the way to try to affect that balance of power, that imbalance of power. This is a problem that I've seen in various countries around the world where it's even more obvious, where governments are funding particular news organizations, icing out, freezing out those who aren't. And, it just takes a certain amount of personal courage to just say, despite all the disadvantages, I'm going to try to be the one that breaks that story.
Thanks.
So I think this is the very last one. I just got this one, and this one is another contractual obligation
Okay. Okay. All right.
because we are in a university. So this one has to do with actually academic freedom of speech. The current administration not only attacks the press and law firms too, because of their DEI policies and other grievances that they came up with. But they also attack universities for this. So I guess the question would be, how does that academic freedom of speech plays out against the administration? I know it's not something you have
Yeah.
seen professionally, because the Times is not a university, but it's another kind of freedom of speech that's being attacked, the academic speech, the freedom of academic speech.
Well, and as I said, I think that earlier is that I think the attack on universities, the attack on law firms, is really designed, and the attack on nonprofits who are doing such good work, in whether it's for civil liberties, immigration rights, whatever it might be, is an attempt to kind of undermine the natural alliances. This is with all these questions, I've tried to focus on things that we could do as lawyers, we could do as journalists, and we could do as citizens. But at the end of the day, all of these places, including the U.S. government and universities, need ethical and strong leaders. We're not going to get to a better place until you have, leaders who are willing to take courageous stands, who are willing to be tolerant, they're willing to be ethical in the way power gets exercised, and we can change that over time. But when so many of the problems, though, you see are just that we're being led by people who, in many institutions, are not really up to the task. At least not up to the task that we need.
So the concept of anticipatory obedience that you mentioned at the end of your talk should also apply to universities, so they don't give in.
I think universities are, university presidents are in a really tough place. But when you see the people who have stood up, the president of Princeton, the president of Harvard, it's inspiring. There's a lot of money on the line. The truth is that the federal government can, in fact, affect universities. Just, in our industry, we've seen it that, CBS settles with President Trump because they want to, their parent company settles with President Trump because they want to get a merger passed. ABC's concerned about regulatory things. They settle with President Trump. We're fortunate at the New York Times in that we don't have those kind of federal connections. But, shame on the federal government for using them to try to impoverish the public discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think.
Thank you.
Thanks to David for his insight and wisdom. Thank you, Amaya and Oscar, for being leaders at the CPI and for being such extraordinary journalists. Gracias a todas las personas que nos han acompañado hoy. Gracias a la Facultad de Derecho por recibirnos siempre para nuestras conferencias y nuestros eventos. Esta es nuestra casa y ustedes son la audiencia que nos impulsa y nos inspira a seguir haciendo nuestro trabajo todos los días. Gracias al equipo del CPI por toda la labor que hacen comprometida con nuestro país, y que tengan todos muy buenas noches y hasta la próxima.